It began with something that should have been ordinary, a forgotten phone lying on a cracked sidewalk in Krasnodar, Russia. On September 11th, 2017, a construction worker bent down, picked it up, and did what any decent person would do. He tried to find the owner. But when he opened the gallery, the world shifted. Staring back at him were photographs no one should ever see: a man grinning into the camera while holding a severed hand, body parts arranged like a grotesque still life, images so disturbing that within hours they spread through police networks, and within days across the world. Russian media had a name ready before investigators even arrived: the cannibal couple. But the real truth was stranger, smaller, and infinitely sadder than the legend that followed. Police traced the phone to a rundown dormitory on the grounds of a former military academy. Inside that decaying room lived 3 5-year-old Dmitry Bakshav and his 4 2-year-old wife, Natalia. Unemployed, drowning in poverty, surviving off odd jobs and welfare. Their home was a single suffocating room stacked with garbage, bottles, and an odor neighbors had complained about for years: rot, stale alcohol, and something metallic. When police stepped inside, they immediately knew. What they had seen in the phone was real. One of the photos had been taken there, right on that dirty floor, beside old furniture and peeling wallpaper. Rumors exploded. Telegram channels and tabloids claimed the couple had killed and eaten as many as 30 people. They said police found jars filled with human flesh, handwritten recipe books, body parts hidden in the walls. It took only 24 hours for the world to believe they were monsters. Under pressure, investigators launched 2 simultaneous operations, one for murder, one for suspected cannibalism. Forensic teams tore the dorm apart, checking every corner, draining pipes, digging through landfills, examining nearby forests with cadaver dogs. But the evidence pointed in only one direction. The body parts belonged to one woman, 3 5-year-old Alina Vasheva, an acquaintance who had been drinking with the couple just days before. Witnesses said Alina visited often. Natalia was jealous of her. Piece by piece, detectives reconstructed the night. Between September 8th and 9th, during a drunken argument, Natalia accused Alina of flirting with her husband. Tempers rose, and in that suffocating room, in the chaos of cheap alcohol and years of resentment, Dmitry attacked her. Alina died there, not in a ritual, not in a killing spree, but in a filthy apartment, drowning in jealousy and rage. What happened next is what shocked the world. Instead of calling the police, Dmitry body. He posed with the remains, smiling a performance he never explained. The next morning, he threw the phone away. Some say he lost it. Some say he wanted it to be found. During interrogation, husband and wife turned on each other. Dmitry claimed Natalia ordered him to do it. Natalia said she was terrified of him. Investigators saw the truth: a toxic marriage steeped in alcohol, control, jealousy, a slow burn that eventually reached the point of no return. Meanwhile, the online rumor machine refused the truth. Fake photos from unrelated cases were reposted as evidence. People insisted there were more victims, that it was a cannibal cult, that the police were hiding the truth. But forensic facts don't bend to rumors. Over 2 years of investigation revealed no other remains. No missing persons matched any alleged pattern. All DNA samples belonged to Alina. In the end, the so-called cannibal couple weren't serial killers. They weren't cannibals. They weren't masterminds. Just 2 broken people, drowning in addiction and dysfunction, whose worst night became an international myth. In February 2019, Natalia was convicted of inciting murder. She received 10 years. In June 2019, Dmitry was sentenced to 12 years and 2 months. In February 2020, he died in custody at age 38. No foul play, but his death reignited conspiracy theories because the lie had already swallowed the truth whole. In the end, only one woman died, but online, the couple became the face of a horror story the world refused to let go of. In the quiet farmlands of Missouri, where the wind moves slow and the days feel predictable, no one imagined that horror could take the shape of 2 aging grandparents. But behind a fading white farmhouse in Livingston County, violence was stitched into the rhythm of rural life, hidden beneath overalls, wrinkled smiles, and Sunday church handshakes. Ray and Faye Copeland didn't look like killers. He was 75. She was 69. Their hands were calloused from decades of work, their home surrounded by grazing cattle and vegetable rows. To neighbors, they were ordinary, familiar, safe. But the facade had a crack, one that widened until it exposed one of the most disturbing fraud and murder schemes the Midwest had ever seen. Ray Copeland had always lived on the fringes of trouble. Decades of petty crimes, forged checks, and failed jobs followed him like a shadow he'd stopped trying to outrun. Faye, his soft-spoken wife, played the part of the dutiful partner baking for church, tending the home, never raising her voice. Together, they crafted a disguise that fooled nearly everyone. Between 1986 and 1989, Ray visited shelters and soup kitchens, looking for men who had no family, no home, no one who might check on them if they disappeared. He offered work on his farm cash, a bed, a chance to restart. It sounded like salvation, but Ray had a plan stitched together from greed and ruthlessness. He drove each man to cattle auctions, handed them forged checks, and made them buy livestock under their names. Then he sold the cattle, pocketed the profits, and disappeared before the checks bounced. And when a drifter finally realized what was happening, when he became a liability rather than an asset, Ray made sure he never spoke again. One by one, the men who worked the Copeland farm vanished. Dennis Murphy, Wayne Warner, Jim Dale Harvey, John Freeman, Paul Colwart. All were last seen alive beside Ray working, hauling, feeding cattle. All were later found murdered, each in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle, execution style, a weapon Ray kept beside his bed. For years, the bodies lay in shallow graves scattered across neighboring properties, the truth buried with them. The case cracked open in 1989 when a drifter named Jack McCormick escaped the farmhouse in fear. He told police he'd seen human remains hidden beneath hay in the barn. At first, authorities dismissed his claims as rambling. But then he passed a polygraph. He described details no outsider could know. Deputies secured a search warrant, and the ground began giving up its secrets. The discovery of the graves was chilling enough, but what truly shifted the investigation was something found in the Copeland house. A notebook folded neatly among quilts and linens. On it was a handwritten list of every drifter Ray had hired. Some names were marked with an X. Every X matched a dead man. The elderly couple's arrest shocked the country. Reporters flooded the town. Cameras clogged courthouse steps. No one could reconcile their age with the brutality of the crimes. In interviews, Ray stayed silent, cold, stone-faced, almost indignant. Faye cried, insisting Ray was violent, and she had been forced to obey him. She painted herself as a battered spouse trapped in fear. But investigators didn't see a victim. They saw a partner, someone who washed sheets after each disappearance, who managed the house, who kept the list, someone who stitched herself into the fabric of Ray's crimes. In 1990, Ray was convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to death. He muttered only one thing: they didn't prove a damn thing. The next year, Faye went to trial. Her defense argued domestic abuse. The jury saw complicity. She too was sentenced to death, making them the oldest married couple ever sent to death row in America. But fate settled the case its own way. Ray died in prison in 1993 from natural causes. Faye's sentence was reduced in 1999 after a stroke left her partially paralyzed. She was moved to a nursing home where she died in 2003. Today, the Copeland farmhouse still stands weathered, silent, a lonely monument on a patch of Missouri soil. Nothing grows there now except memory. For locals, the wind that passes through the empty fields still seems to whisper the same haunting truth. Evil doesn't always come young. Sometimes it grows old with you. December in Wichita was supposed to be peaceful, the kind of winter where houses glow with Christmas lights and streets fall quiet under a thin layer of snow. But in 2000, that calm was shattered by 2 brothers whose cruelty would burn itself into Kansas history forever. Reginald and Jonathan Carr didn't look like the kind of men who could bring a city to its knees. Young, ordinary, almost forgettable, the kind of faces you pass every day without a second thought. But for 8 days in December, they became the architects of one of the most violent rampages modern America has ever seen. It began small. A robbery here, a carjacking there, crimes that felt random, desperate, the kind the police see every winter. But the Carr brothers escalated with terrifying speed. They weren't just stealing money. They were experimenting with control, deciding who lived, who suffered, and who wouldn't walk away at all. On December 7th, they kidnapped Andrew Schreiber and a man known publicly only as KB. They forced them to withdraw cash from ATMs across the city, threatening to execute them with every stop. For reasons only they know, both victims were spared. 4 nights later, Mercy disappeared entirely. The brothers targeted 5-year-old librarian Anna Walenta as she parked at her home. When she tried to escape, Reginald fired through her window, shattering glass in silence. Anne managed to dial 911 and give a description before dying at the hospital, her final words becoming a thread investigators would later cling to. But the nightmare was only beginning. December 14th, a quiet suburban house. 5 friends in their 22nds gathered for an ordinary night. Jason Beaufort, Brad Haka, Heather Mueller, Aaron Sander, and a woman whose identity remains protected. Near midnight, the Carr brothers forced their way inside. What happened over the next several hours is something even veteran detectives struggled to speak about. The victims were beaten, terrorized, violated, and forced into degrading acts under threat of execution. The brothers then made each of them withdraw money from ATMs, emptying accounts with cold efficiency. But they weren't done. At around 2 a.m., the victims were driven to a snowy field on the city's outskirts. The wind was sharp. The sky was silent. There, the Carr brothers ordered all 5 to kneel in the frozen grass. And one by one, they killed them. Then they drove away, leaving the field quiet again, except for the breathing of one survivor. Bleeding, barefoot, and the head, the lone surviving woman rose from the snow and stumbled toward the faint glow of a house in the distance. Her courage, her memory, and her will to live became the key that unlocked everything. Her testimony led police to the stolen vehicles, the stolen belongings, the fingerprints, the brothers themselves. The arrest came quickly after they attempted another robbery. When investigators searched their hideout, they found items belonging to the victims, including an engagement ring meant for Heather Mueller from Jason Beaufort. In court, the surviving woman recounted every detail of that night, her voice steady, her memory flawless. Jurors wept. Some left the room. In 2002, both brothers were found guilty of capital murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, robbery, the full weight of every cruelty they inflicted. They were sentenced to death. But the legal battle didn't end there. Appeal after appeal claimed media bias, unfair trials, improper jury instructions. In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the death sentences, igniting outrage statewide. 2 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated them in a near-unanimous ruling. Inconceivable cruelty, the justices called it. Even today, the brothers continue filing appeals from death row, all denied. Kansas has not set an execution date, but their fate is effectively sealed. For Wichita, the scars never faded. Every December, the city remembers the 5 friends whose lives were stolen and the single woman who survived long enough to save their names from disappearing. The Wichita Massacre wasn't just violence. It was the night a city learned that even the quietest winter can hide a storm. In Richmond, Virginia, the year 1979 is remembered as the moment fear seeped into every crack of the city, when people who had never locked their doors suddenly nailed windows shut, and a community learned that the deadliest threats sometimes grow up just across the street. The terror came from 3 brothers, Linwood, James, and Anthony Briley, born and raised in Richmond, children of a respected radio technician and a church choir singer. To the outside world, they were an ordinary, working-class family. Inside their home, something colder had taken root. Linwood, the oldest, was the spark, intelligent, unpredictable, and magnetic in the most dangerous way. Long before the city learned his name, he had already shown flashes of violence. In 1971, at just 16, he aimed a rifle out his bedroom window and a 5-7-year-old neighbor, claiming he mistook him for a strange figure in the yard. He served juvenile time, was released early, and slid back into Richmond like a storm waiting to break. James and Anthony gravitated toward him. They admired him, feared him, followed him. By March 1979, the brothers were ready to carve their names into the city's history. Their crimes had no pattern, no logic, no specific type of victim. That unpredictability, that randomness, is what terrified Richmond most. Their first major victim was William Bill Harvey, a beloved local radio host. The brothers broke into his home, robbed him, and set him on fire while he was still alive. It was the kind of crime that told detectives, this isn't about theft, this is about domination. After that, Richmond began drowning in fear. People who stepped outside to buy groceries never came home. Drivers were without warning. Couples in parked cars became targets. Families were attacked for no reason other than being the next name in the brothers' path. The Brileys treated the city like their hunting ground. By fall, detectives were working around the clock, sleeping in their offices, reviewing autopsy reports that felt like scenes from nightmares. But with no motive and almost no survivors, the Brileys moved like ghosts, always present, never caught. Then came the crime that broke Richmond's heart. On October 19th, the brothers targeted the home of 3-year-old Harvey Wilkerson. Inside were his partner Judy Barton and her 5-year-old son. They bound them, terrorized them, and all three. Judy was pregnant. Even hardened homicide detectives walked out of the house in tears. That murder became the beginning of the end. Investigators finally caught a break when Duncan Meekins, a friend and occasional accomplice, was arrested on unrelated charges. Faced with life behind bars, he decided to talk. His confession was terrifying. He described how the brothers' excitement, how they laughed at news reports of their own crimes, how they celebrated chaos like it was a game. With his testimony, detectives connected the Brileys to 11 murders over 8 devastating months. On October 20th, 1979, the brothers were arrested. No chase, no struggle, just quiet, an unsettling kind of calm. In the interrogation room, Linwood smiled. James cracked jokes. Anthony remained nearly silent. It was as if none of them grasped the weight of what they'd done, or perhaps they understood perfectly and didn't care. Their trials in 1980 were some of the most publicized Virginia had ever seen. The evidence was overwhelming. Stolen items, fingerprints, witnesses, and Meekins' chilling testimony tying everything together. Linwood and James received death sentences. Anthony, the youngest, was given multiple life terms. For Richmond, it felt like closure until the unthinkable happened. On May 31st, 1984, Linwood and James Briley carried out one of the largest and most terrifying prison escapes in Virginia history. Along with 4 other inmates, they overpowered guards, staged a bomb threat, stole uniforms, and simply walked out through the front gate of the Mecklenburg Correctional Center. 19 days of nationwide panic followed. Schools locked their doors. Families slept with lights on. Richmond braced for the possibility that the brothers would return. But on June 19th, the FBI cornered them in Philadelphia. They surrendered without a fight. Linwood was executed later that year. James followed the next. Neither expressed remorse. Neither offered apologies. Anthony Briley remains behind bars, even today, serving multiple life sentences. Duncan Meekins, the accomplice whose cooperation cracked the case, is also still incarcerated. For those who lived through 1979, the memories have never faded. People still recall how they refused to stop at red lights after dark, how every knock at the door made their hearts race, how the Briley name became something you only whispered. Richmond learned a brutal lesson that year. Sometimes evil doesn't sneak into your community. Sometimes it grows up right there. By the late 1970s, Los Angeles was living through a strange illusion. Hollywood glamour on the surface, shadows spreading underneath. The city glowed with sunshine, billboards and freeway traffic, but in the hills overlooking it all, something dark was unfolding. Young women were disappearing. Their bodies later found staged on steep embankments, posed almost like warnings. The press called the killer the Hillside Strangler. No one imagined there were 2. Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi were cousins, a pair whose cruelty fed off one another in a way investigators had rarely seen. Buono, 42, ran a small upholstery shop in Glendale. Outwardly, he looked like an ordinary blue-collar man with a bad temper. Bianchi, at 26, was younger, restless, and constantly searching for a shortcut to success. He idolized Buono's confidence and swagger, a combination that became a spark for something far more dangerous. Their partnership began with manipulation. They posed as undercover police officers, flashing fake badges, pulling women over on the street, offering rides, or demanding to question them. Once the victim stepped inside Buono's home, the act fell away. The first known victim was 9-year-old Yolanda Washington, whose body was found near the Ventura Freeway in October 1977. Within days, another young girl, Judith Miller, just 15, appeared in similar condition. Then came Lisa Caston, a waitress, then Lauren Wagner, a college student. Each girl was discovered in a way that told detectives the same chilling truth. These were not spontaneous acts, they were ritualistic. Rope marks on the neck, signs of staging, makeup reapplied, fingernails cleaned, bodies carefully positioned on hillsides facing the city lights. The killings came in rapid sequence. By early 1978, Los Angeles was living in collective fear. Women traveled in groups, refused to walk alone at night, changed their routines, and stayed close to well-lit streets. Even then, the killers stayed ahead of the investigation, as if they understood how law enforcement worked. A massive task force was formed, one of the largest in California's history. But before detectives could piece together the clues, the killings suddenly stopped. For months, the case froze. It felt as if the city was holding its breath. Then far north in Bellingham, Washington, two college students, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder, were found tangled in the same pattern. The man arrested there was Kenneth Bianchi. When detectives searched his home, the evidence linking him back to Los Angeles was undeniable. But the most shocking moment came when Bianchi tried to avoid responsibility by claiming he had multiple personalities, an alter ego named Steve, who committed the murders while he had no memory. It was an act. Psychologists saw through it almost instantly. With the walls closing in, Bianchi began negotiating. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he offered to testify against his cousin, Angelo Buono. What he described painted a portrait of a sadistic partnership. Buono, dominant, cold, methodical. Bianchi desperate to impress him, to belong, to prove himself useful. Together, they hunted, assaulted, and murdered at least 10 young women between October 1977 and February 1978. In court, Bianchi detailed how they used fake police credentials to handcuff victims, how they took them to Buono's house, and how the were carried out behind closed doors. Throughout the testimony, Buono stared ahead, expressionless, denying everything, but the forensics aligned perfectly with Bianchi's statements. In 1983, Angelo Buono was convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to life without parole. Kenneth Bianchi was already serving a life sentence in Washington for the Bellingham murders. The cousins, once inseparable, never saw each other again. But even in prison, the manipulation continued. Bianchi faked breakdowns, wrote letters to women on the outside, even convinced one to marry him. Buono, despite maintaining his innocence, attracted his own circle of supporters who believed he was framed. In 2002, Angelo Buono died in his cell at the age of 67. Bianchi remains incarcerated in Washington, repeatedly seeking parole and repeatedly denied. The parole board continues to describe him as manipulative, dangerous, and without remorse. The Hillside Stranglers changed Los Angeles forever. They forced a generation of women to fear authority uniforms and the very streets they walked every day. And they taught investigators that 2 killers working together could be far more unpredictable and more terrifying than one acting alone. Just after sunrise in June 2009, the still water of the Rideau Canal in Kingston, Ontario, revealed a sight that silenced even the most seasoned police officers. A black Nissan Sentra lay submerged near the locks, nose-down windows, sealed headlights, dim beneath the surface. Inside were 4 women, 3 teenage sisters, and a 50-year-old woman, all from the same family. At first, the scene looked like a tragic accident, a midnight drive gone wrong. But the moment investigators saw how the vehicle had entered the water, the clean angle, the intact windows, the position of the seats, the word accident evaporated. What happened to the Shafia women was no misfortune. It was a decision. The victims were 1 9-year-old Zainab, 1 7-year-old Sahar, 1 3-year-old Gidi, and Rona Amir Muhammad, the quiet, soft-spoken first wife in a polygamous household. Their deaths led investigators into the heart of a family torn between 2 worlds, the public image of success and the private reality of suffocating control. To understand the crime, detectives needed to understand the Shafia home. Mohammed Shafia, an Afghan-Canadian businessman, had built a fortune through real estate and small ventures. He presented himself as a stern but respectable patriarch. His second wife, Tuba Yahya, stayed by his side, obedient, loyal, unquestioning. Their son Hamed, 18, followed his father's commands without hesitation. The first wife, Rona, lived in the shadows. Forced into polygamy, isolated, treated like a servant, she clung only to the girls, who saw her as a second mother. Behind the doors of their Montreal home, the atmosphere was oppressive. The daughters walked on invisible lines, forbidden to dress like Canadian teens, to speak freely, to socialize with boys. Any sign of independence was considered shame. Zainab had a boyfriend. Sahar confided to teachers that her father called her degrading names. Giti begged child services to take her away. Even Rona whispered to relatives overseas that she feared for her life. To outsiders, they were a family adjusting to a new country. Inside, they were a family preparing to explode. On June 22, 2009, the Shafias left Montreal on what they describe as a family vacation. 2 cars, a Lexus SUV, and the Nissan Sentra. They drove through Toronto toward Niagara Falls. Somewhere along those quiet highways, a plan months, maybe years in the making, moved from intention to action. According to evidence later revealed in court, sometime after midnight on June 30th, the 4 victims were placed inside the Nissan. The vehicle was driven to Kingston Mills, an isolated canal site, and pushed into the water, likely using the family's Lexus to ram it forward. The car sank quickly. The women had no chance. By morning, the surviving family members, Mohammed, Tuba, and Hamed, told police the victims had left the motel alone and must have simply crashed by mistake. But the calmness of their story didn't match the horror of the scene. Detectives noticed immediately. No skid marks. No sign of panic. No attempt to open the doors from the inside. And, most damning, the family's grief felt rehearsed. Hamed's timeline didn't match phone records. The Lexus showed damage consistent with pushing another vehicle, and the victim's luggage was arranged too neatly, as if prepared, not hastily grabbed. Then came the moment investigators caught their break. The police began recording the family's private conversations. What they heard destroyed any remaining illusion of innocence. Mohammed's voice was calm, almost proud, as he spoke about the daughters bringing shame upon him. Tuba agreed softly. Hamed offered no objection. These recordings became the backbone of the prosecution. In July 2009, all 3 were arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The trial in 2011 captivated the entire country. The Crown argued this was an honor killing, orchestrated as a family unit to restore the father's damaged sense of pride. Evidence showed Hamed had scouted the canal days earlier. Forensics confirmed the Lexus had been used as a battering ram. The defense insisted it was a tragic accident, but no version of the story could survive the evidence. After only 15 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict. Guilty, all 3, on all counts. They were sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. In the courtroom, Muhammad Shafia declared, "We are not murderers." But his denial meant little against hours of recordings capturing his own voice condemning the 4 women he was meant to protect. As of 2025, all 3 remain incarcerated. Their appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada was rejected. Their sentences stand. The Shafia case remains one of Canada's most disturbing crimes, not just because 4 lives were taken, but because their killers were the very people who should have loved them most. A crime committed not out of rage, but out of belief. A belief so twisted that reputation meant more than life itself. In April 2016, Pike County, Ohio, a rural stretch of quiet roads and rolling fields woke up to a tragedy so vast that even seasoned lawmen struggled to comprehend it. 8 members of the Rodin family were found murdered across 4 separate homes. Each victim shot at close range, each deliberate, precise, almost military in execution. It was the largest mass murder in Ohio's history. And from the very beginning, investigators knew one thing. This wasn't random. There were no signs of forced entry. Dogs were left alive, children were spared, and found sleeping beside their murdered parents. Whoever had done this knew the Rodins knew where they slept, how they lived, where they kept their keys, even what time their lights went out. Rumors exploded. People whispered about drug cartels, revenge killings, interstate crime rings, but none of those theories survived long. The truth when it surfaced was colder and infinitely more personal. It was another family, the Wagners. A father, a mother, 2 grown sons, a family who moved together, spoke together, and ultimately killed together. The connection between the 2 families began years earlier when Jake Wagner, the youngest son, entered a relationship with Hannah Rodin, one of the victims. They had a daughter, but the relationship was turbulent. Jealousy, control, custody disputes, accusations whispered behind closed doors. When Hannah left Jake and refused to sign custody papers, granting him full control over their daughter, something inside the Wagner household hardened. According to prosecutors, that was the moment the plot began. And it was a plot crafted with unsettling patience. The Wagner family studied the Rodins' routines. They purchased surveillance equipment, tracked cell phones, forged documents, built homemade silencers, tested ammunition, scouted locations. This wasn't rage. It was a mission. On the night of April 21st, 2016, under the cover of darkness, the Wagners moved as a 4-person unit. They drove to the rural properties where the Rodins lived, splitting into teams. Inside those homes where children slept and the world was silent, they executed 8 people. Chris Rodin Sr., Gary Rodin, Frankie Rodin, Hannah Gilley, Dana Rodin, Hannah Mae Rodin, Chris Rodin Jr., Kenneth Rodin. Some were multiple times. One was murdered while lying beside her newborn baby. Doors showed no signs of tampering. Investigators believe the victims likely knew their well enough to open their doors without hesitation. By sunrise, an entire branch of a family had been wiped out, and the Wagners behaved as though nothing had happened. They attended funerals, sat beside grieving relatives, posted condolences online. Jake Wagner even gave interviews speaking about the tragedy in a quiet, broken voice. The performance was convincing for a while, but the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation launched one of the most extensive investigations in state history. Over 3,000 hours of detective work, 19,000 tips, hundreds of interviews. The walls began to close in. The breakthrough came when investigators uncovered forged custody documents, text messages linking the family to the motive, homemade silencers, gun parts matching shell casings, GPS data placing the Wagners at the scene. In November 2018, all 4 members of the Wagner family were arrested in coordinated raids. The charges were staggering: 8 counts of aggravated murder, conspiracy, burglary, unlawful possession of dangerous ordnance. As the trials unfolded, the family began to fracture. Angela Wagner, the mother, pleaded guilty in 2021 to conspiracy and burglary, admitting she helped plan the murders. She agreed to testify against her husband and sons in exchange for a 30-year sentence. Jake Wagner, the youngest son, the one whose custody battle lay at the heart of the violence, pleaded guilty to all 8 murders. He admitted with chilling calm that he believed the Rodins was the only way to protect his daughter. His plea deal avoided the death penalty. When asked in court if anyone else had participated in the murders, Jake answered, "Yes, my family." George Wagner IV, who insisted he had no knowledge of the plan, was found guilty in 2022 on all counts and received 8 life sentences without parole. As of 2025, Jake Wagner remains in maximum security, eligible for parole only after 32 years, a ruling currently under appeal. George Wagner IV will never be released. Angela Wagner continues serving her 30-year sentence. George Billy Wagner III, the father, still awaits trial and maintains he is innocent. For Pike County, the tragedy never truly receded. 8 lives gone, 1 child now caught between 2 families permanently scarred by bloodshed, and a community that learned a terrifying truth. Sometimes the danger isn't a stranger. Sometimes it's the family next door, planning in silence, acting together, and convincing themselves they were right. On a quiet September afternoon in 2017, firefighters in Wimbledon, a peaceful suburban part of South London, responded to what sounded like a routine call, smoke rising from a backyard fire. They expected a small burn pile, maybe trash or garden waste. But when they stepped into the yard, the scene froze them in place. In a shallow pit beneath smoldering wood and debris was the charred body of a young woman, a fire hot enough to warp metal, a smell that clung to the air like a warning. That woman was 21-year-old Sophie Lionnet, a French au pair who had come to London chasing hope, language, and a chance to see the world. She had been living in that very house for more than a year, under the roof of a couple whose delusions would end her life. The couple were Sabrina Kouider, a glamorous but volatile French-Algerian fashion designer, and her partner, Wissam Medouni, a quiet, soft-spoken man who followed her lead with unsettling devotion. To neighbors, they seemed eccentric but harmless. Inside their home, they were spiraling into a world built entirely from paranoia. Sabrina Kouider had once dated Mark Walton, a musician and founding member of the boy band Boyzone. The relationship had ended years earlier, but in Sabrina's mind, it had never really ended. She became consumed by the idea that Walton was stalking her, hacking her devices, spying on her family. And in her delusion, she convinced Wissam to believe it too. When Sophie arrived in 2016 to care for their children, she stepped unknowingly into this storm. What began as a nanny job quickly shifted into something darker. Sabrina became obsessed, accusing Sophie, a shy, gentle girl with limited English, of colluding with Walton, of secretly recording conversations, of working as a spy. The accusations grew louder, more irrational, more dangerous. Sophie's phone was confiscated. She was isolated from friends. She was forced to write bizarre false confessions. Neighbors heard shouting intimidation, the thud of fists on walls. Whenever social services or police were called, Sabrina's charisma and manipulation smoothed everything over. No one realized how desperate Sophie had become. By September 2017, she had lost weight, sounded exhausted over the phone, and told friends she only wanted to go home, but Sabrina wouldn't let her leave. The final hours of Sophie's life were recorded 8 hours of video where Sabrina interrogated her relentlessly, accusing her of being part of an imaginary plot. Sophie, terrified and starving, apologized repeatedly, trying to placate her abusers. The interrogation escalated into violence. Beatings, drowning attempts. By the next morning, Sophie Lynette was dead. Instead of calling authorities, Sabrina and Wissam tried to erase her. They carried her body into the garden, built a crude pyre, and set it alight, believing somehow that the flames would hide what they had done. But the smoke betrayed them. A neighbor smelled something strange, looked over the fence, and called emergency services. Moments later, firefighters uncovered Sophie's remains. Police arrived within minutes. Sabrina claimed Sophie had been alive when the fire started. Wissam blamed Sabrina entirely, but the evidence, the recordings, the notes, the timeline revealed a year-long campaign of fear and control. The case shocked Britain. How could a young au pair, employed by a wealthy, educated couple in the heart of London, become the target of a fantasy so delusional it took her life? How did no one see the danger sooner? At trial in 2018, Sabrina showed the same arrogance she had displayed in her interrogations, interrupting witnesses, insisting she was the victim. Wissam appeared broken, acknowledging they had lost control, as though that softened what they had done. The jury saw through both. On May 24, 2018, Sabrina Kuiter and Wissam Madouni were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 30 years. The judge called it a long and brutal course of conduct, driven by entirely unfounded fantasy. Sophie's parents sat through every day of the trial, holding photos of their daughter smiling, hopeful, full of dreams she never got to live. Her ashes were taken home to France, to the town of Troyes, where she was laid to rest. On her gravestone, her family chose words that captured everything she was meant to be. She came to London to live. She left this world for heaven. Sophie's story remains a haunting reminder of how isolation and unchecked obsession can grow into something monstrous, even in the middle of a modern city, behind the doors of a seemingly ordinary home. By the time the 1,970 seconds came to a close, California had already seen more serial killers than any state should ever know: the Zodiac, the Manson cult, the Hillside Stranglers. But there was one pair whose crimes carved through 3 states and left investigators stunned by how far domination and obedience could twist a human soul. Their names were Gerald Armand Gallego and Charlene Williams, a husband and wife team whose van became a roaming prison and whose partnership turned murder into a ritual they carried out with chilling precision. Gerald Gallego was born into violence. His father, a man he barely knew, was executed for murder. His childhood was marked by instability, arrests, and outbursts, so explosive that people learned to step out of his path. By his 20s, he had already accumulated a record filled with assault, robbery, and sexual violence. Charlene was nothing like him on the surface. She came from a comfortable Sacramento family, a quiet girl, intelligent, insecure, drawn to danger like a moth to a flame. When she met Gerald in 1977, she didn't just fall in love, she surrendered. Gerald became the axis of her world, and slowly he began shaping her into the partner he needed, obedient, submissive, and willing to follow him into the darkest corners of his fantasies. Those fantasies soon became real. Their first known victims were one 7-year-old Rhonda Scheffler and one 6-year-old Kippy Vaught. On September 11, 1978, Charlene approached them outside a Sacramento mall with a friendly smile and an easy offer, a ride to a party. The girls accepted. Hours later, they were dead. Investigators would later learn how the Gallegos operated. Charlene lured, Gerald controlled. The van, the so-called love van, became a mobile torture chamber. Once the victims were inside, there was no escape. Their next victims were 2-year-old Brenda Judd and 4-year-old Sandra Cawley, taken from a Reno fairground in June 1979. Then more girls across California and Nevada abducted near malls, parking lots, sidewalks, places where a soft-spoken woman made them feel safe enough to approach. The couple perfected a routine. Charlene would talk, Gerald would strike. When he was finished with the victims, they disposed of the bodies in remote, isolated locations. The violence escalated over time, more calculated, more rehearsed, more confident. Then came November 1st, 1980, the night that finally ended their spree. Charlene and Gerald approached 2 one-year-old Craig Miller and 2 two-year-old Mary Beth Sowers, a young couple outside a Sacramento nightclub. This time their pattern broke. They took both a man and a woman. Craig's body was discovered the next day, ahead near a highway turnout. Mary Beth vanished. But the Gallegos made a fatal mistake. Multiple witnesses had seen their van and memorized part of the license plate. Within days, police traced the vehicle to Charlene's parents. The couple fled, running across Nevada, Oregon, and toward the Midwest. But the manhunt was relentless. On November 17, 1980, they were captured in Omaha, Nebraska, ending 2 years of abductions, assaults, and murders. Even in custody, Gerald refused to cooperate. Charlene, facing the death penalty, broke first. She confessed everything: how Gerald controlled her, how he forced her to participate, how she watched the assaults, how she helped lure victims and hide evidence. Her confession was delivered with eerie calm, not the voice of someone reliving trauma, but the voice of someone describing a routine. In exchange for testifying, Charlene received a plea deal, 16 years and 8 months in prison. Gerald faced trials in both California and Nevada. Both states sought the death penalty. In Nevada, he was convicted of 2 murders in 1983 and sentenced to death. In California, he was convicted again in 1985 and received a second death sentence. He became one of the very few criminals in American history sentenced to die by 2 different states. When asked if he wanted to speak before sentencing, Gerald smirked and said, "I have nothing to apologize for." Charlene served her term quietly. She earned a college degree in prison. She volunteered. She expressed remorse. Many never believed her. Gerald Gallego spent the next 2 decades on death row, filing appeals, granting interviews, boasting about his crimes. He died of cancer in 2002, long before either state could carry out his execution. Charlene was released in 1997 after serving just over 16 years. She changed her name and vanished from public life, leaving behind a trail of outrage and unanswered questions. Authorities believe there may have been more victims, girls whose bodies were never found, whose disappearances were never connected. The story of Gerald and Charlene Gallego remains one of the most disturbing studies of dominance and submission in American crime. A partnership built on fear, bound by violence, and remembered as one of the darkest husband and wife killing teams the country has ever known. In the early 1990 seconds, Canada watched what seemed like a picture-perfect couple: Grace magazine covers, engagement photos, and suburban streets. 2 young blondes, smiling, beautiful, polished, the kind of couple people describe with words like charming or ideal. Underneath that bright exterior was a relationship steeped in cruelty, a partnership built on dominance, manipulation, and violence that would shock the entire country. His name was Paul Bernardo. Hers was Karla Homolka. Together, they became the most infamous serial killing pair Canada had ever known, the couple later nicknamed the Ken and Barbie Killers. Paul Bernardo grew up in Scarborough, Ontario. Clean-cut, polite, ambitious. From the outside, he was the kind of young man any parent would welcome into their home. But beneath that polished surface, Paul hid a darkness he nurtured quietly. Between 1987 and 1990, police were searching for an unidentified predator, terrorizing women near bus stops. More than a dozen victims had reported the same pattern of assault: a man who seemed to appear from nowhere, violent and methodical. The press called him the Scarborough Rapist. What no one knew then was that the predator and the charming young accountant-to-be were the same person. In 1987, Paul met 17-year-old Karla Homolka at a hotel restaurant. Their connection was immediate, intense, intoxicating, and dangerous. Karla wasn't alarmed when Paul revealed his darker fantasies. She embraced them, encouraged them, fed them. To Paul, she was perfect, a partner who didn't recoil at his confessions but leaned into them. By 1990, their relationship had evolved into something twisted. Paul fixated on Karla's younger sister, 5-year-old Tammy. In one of the most disturbing acts in Canadian criminal history, Carla, in a grotesque attempt to please Paul, drugged her sister with stolen anesthetics from her veterinary job. Paul assaulted Tammy while Carla watched. When Tammy stopped breathing, they panicked and called 911, claiming she had choked on alcohol. The death was ruled accidental. That night could have ended everything. Instead, it became the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Paul and Carla abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 2 more teenage girls. One 4-year-old, Leslie Mahaffey. One 5-year-old, Kristen French. Both victims were held captive for days. Both were recorded on videotape, the couple laughing, instructing, and participating in the abuse. Both were murdered afterward. Leslie's body was dismembered and encased in concrete blocks thrown into a lake. Kristen's body was found in a ditch. As the crimes escalated, so did the investigation. In 1992, a breakthrough came. DNA finally identified Paul Bernardo as the Scarborough rapist. The facade collapsed. Carla fled the house and told her family she was a battered, terrified wife, a claim that would later complicate everything. When police first arrested Paul, they still hadn't found the videotapes, the irrefutable evidence of Carla's active involvement. All they had was her testimony. Believing she was a victim, prosecutors offered her a plea deal, 12 years in prison, in exchange for testifying against Bernardo. It became known nationwide as the deal with the devil. Weeks later, the tapes were found hidden inside a ceiling light fixture, and the truth hit like a shockwave. The footage showed Carla not as a coerced observer, but as an enthusiastic participant, laughing, directing, assaulting, a partner, not a prisoner. But the deal had already been signed. There was no taking it back. Paul Bernardo's 1,995 trial was one of the most watched in Canadian history. The evidence was overwhelming DNA testimony and the horrific videotapes. He was convicted of murder, abduction, sexual assault, and the death of Tammy Homolka. He received life in prison with no chance of parole and was later declared a dangerous offender, ensuring he can never be released. Carla served her entire 12-year sentence and walked free in 2005. She changed her name, started a new family, and attempted to disappear from public view, though Canadians never truly forgot. Paul Bernardo remains incarcerated. In 2023, a transfer from maximum to medium security ignited national outrage, forcing a federal review of prison procedures. For many families of the victims, even the idea of Bernardo living under less restrictive conditions felt unbearable. The Ken and Barbie nickname coined by tabloids to highlight the unsettling contrast between their beauty and their brutality remains a chilling symbol of deception. They were a couple who smiled in photos while hiding tapes of torture behind cabinet doors. A couple who blended into suburban life while carrying secrets that would haunt Canada for decades. And a reminder that sometimes the monsters are the ones who look perfect from far away. In every case we've explored, the violence didn't come from strangers lurking in alleyways or masks hidden behind shadows. It came from within. Families, the people meant to protect, to nurture, to care, became the very source of terror. Some jealousy, some out of greed, some out of twisted loyalty, delusion, belief, or the desperate need to control. Others convinced themselves that honor mattered more than life, that love required obedience, that blood was a weapon they had the right to use. But beneath every motive was the same truth. Evil doesn't always arrive with the roar of footsteps in the dark. Sometimes it grows quietly at the dinner table. Sometimes it sleeps in the next room. Sometimes it carries your last name. The Buckshayevs, the Copelands, the Carr brothers, the Briley's families, who turned their homes into battlegrounds and their victims into afterthoughts. The Hillside Stranglers, the Shafias, the Wagner's killers, who planned together, hunted together, convinced themselves they were justified. The Gallegos, Bernardo, and Homolka couples who fused love with violence until neither could be separated. Different stories, different decades, different countries, but each one carried the same echo. A line crossed so quietly that no one saw the danger until it was too late. We often imagine evil as something foreign, something we could spot if we look closely enough. A stranger's face, a suspicious voice, a threat we'd recognize in time. But these cases remind us of what's far more terrifying. Monsters don't always come from the outside. Sometimes they grow from the inside out. A partner you trust, a sibling you grew up with, a parent you depended on, a lover who whispered forever. In the end, the question isn't how these families became killers. The question is how long the warning signs had been there, hiding behind smiles, dinners, photographs, and memories of better times. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. You never truly know what someone is capable of until the moment you do, and by then, it's already too late. As the stories fade and the names become case files, only one thing remains. A reminder that trust is fragile, control is dangerous. And the people closest to us can sometimes be the ones who walk us into the dark. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, not every monster hides in the shadows. Some stand right beside you.